Hello and welcome to Scale Stuff. This week, it's time to get out the eye patch and cutlass and lose track of your rum, as in this week's video, I'm going to be building the Mr. Craft Hobby Kits 1:120 scale pirate ship, the Black Falcon, an alleged ship of the notorious 17th century pirate Captain Kidd, though there's not much historical proof for this. Either way, I fancied painting something old and nautical, and this fitted the bill and the budget nicely. In the box, you get a full colour instruction manual, and the bits to build the ship. The parts look pretty scant, so this should be a simple kit to make. A first look at the sprues show that there is going to be a fair bit of flash to clean up on this kit. There's also no numbers on any of the parts, but as there are so few of them, this shouldn't be an issue. The details look fairly simple, but I'm feeling optimistic about this kit. This kit is a rebox of a kit made in the 1980s by a Czech model company called Smer. It even shows their brand on some of the parts. The sprues look pretty standard for a kit made during this time. I'm a bit disappointed that the kit does not have any sails with it though. Anyway, onto the build. First thing the instructions ask you to build is the masts, but I'm not in the mood to build sticks at the moment, so I'm going to start off with the upper deck and hull, as this area will need to be pre-painted before I add the mast later anyway. Before I start assembly, I'm going to clean up some of the parts. The hull has some meaty attachment points that need removing, and there's quite a bit of thick flash around a lot of the parts, so they all need a sand to sort them out. With the upper deck parts cleaned up, it's time to add them. They go on okay, the tolerance between them is a bit rubbish, but the glue should sort that out. The kit here wants me to add the cannons at this stage, but I'm going to leave them off as I want to pre-paint them. I'm not sure on the wheel of this model. Is this accurate? I'm not entirely sure. Seems a bit weird to have it backwards. But then again, I live miles away from the ocean, so what do I know about boats? I'm also going to leave off the lifeboat, as the grill this goes onto will need to be a different colour and will be tricky to paint with the lifeboat glued in place. Now it's time to build the main hull. More cleanup is needed here. The front mast or bowsprit needs quite a bit of cleanup. It's easily done with sandpaper, but there is a nasty feed port on this that will need to be snipped off. The two hull side pieces also need a fair bit of cleaning up. Most of this is pretty standard stuff, but there are a couple of nasty feed bumps on the keel bits that will need to be cut off, otherwise the fit here would be terrible. With the main hull bits cleaned up, it's time to assemble the hull. This bit's a little tricky, as there's a fair bit to juggle. I'm going at it by first fitting the deck to one side. As the deck needs to be bent over, a few of these locating pins in the side to fit properly. With the side in, I trap it in place with the other side. The fit's a bit tricky to line up, but when it clicks into place, it's fairly decent. Using bulldog clips and elastic bands to hold the bits that are in position will make the whole task a lot less frustrating. With the hull nearly dry, I move on to cleanup. There's a little step between both sides, so I'm sanding back these lines here to get a good smooth finish, as no one wants a seam line on the keel. With the seam line sorted out, I add the figurehead and bowsprit to the front of the ship. There's tons of dust on this model, and I'm going to need to give it a wash before I paint it with all the amount of sanding I've had to do. While I'm doing this, I spotted a gap near the rear of the ship, so I'm going to fill this in using a couple of small pieces of plastic card. Before I paint the hull, I use a sharp knife to scour in a muzzle to all of the cannons, as the cannons don't have this detail moulded into them, which is a bit disappointing. The ship's really coming together now though, it's really starting to look the part. I'm going to give the model a quick wash to remove all the dust and paint this in a base coat of Humbrol desert sand. As normal, I'm doing this spray painting off screen and outside to avoid fumigating myself. And this is how it's looking with the base coat down. I'm quite happy with this as a base coat, but I've run out of desert tan, so I need to stock up or change tack. Now I'm going to work on the cannons. The amount of flash here is really bad. There's also a nasty ejection port mark that will need to be filled. It's too deep to just scrape it off without it looking daft. I'm going to address these little bits off screen, as these bits are really tiny, the camera's struggling to focus on them, and all you're going to see if I try and film it is fingers and thumbs. I'm also at this stage adding the bore to the cannons, as again, these are not moulded in. Cannons done, it's onto the masts. These bits are going to be a bit of a pain, no numbers to tell which part is which, and lots of flash to clean up here. Sanding sticks are making light work of the flash, and a sharp knife is getting the rest. Working out which part's which is a bit of an issue, but I'm finding building over the colour plan is helping, as the image here gives more information than the instructions. After struggling with the yards, it turns out the parts in this kit actually do have numbers. Tiny, tiny numbers printed on the part, which has really made me breathe a sigh of relief, as I was starting to worry I'd get the thing all mixed up. Off screen I added the yards and booms to the masts. These bits are tricky to line up and to get them fitted square. With them on though, that concludes the masts for now. Now it's time for some pre-painting. First colour I'm going to do is the red, as this will be harder to paint later on. For this I'm using Army Painter Pure Red. I'm following the paint guide here and painting the insides of the ship side walls and deck clutter in this shade. Some of these areas would have been easier and neater to pre-paint earlier on, but with some patience they can be painted afterwards. The paint job I'm doing here looks a little messy at the moment, but later colours will cover the overpainted areas. I get the feeling with this model it's going to look a right pig's ear until the black paint layer goes on at the end and ties all the colours together. This is how it's looking with all the red paint down. Next up I'm painting the yellow on the upper decks. For this I'm using Army Painter Basilisk Brown, as it's a fairly decent match for the Royal Navy Orca Yellow. The paint's going on well, but I'm really regretting painting the red over the gun ports, as now I'm going to need to put 2 coats of Basilisk Brown down. But hey ho, you live and learn. This step's a nice and easy paint though. 3 coats of yellow later, that's it done. It's really starting to look the part. With the yellow on and dry, it's time to paint the white lower hull of the ship. For this, I'm using Tamiya XF2 Flat White Ago, as some of the whites I've used in the past are a bit more gloss than I'd like, so I'm hoping that Tamiya's offering is a little bit more on the matte side. This white layer is also going to need a few coats to build it up and get a good finish. And this is the white on and finished. Next, it's the black. For this, I'm using Army Painter Matte Black. There's a lot of black to paint on this model, and it's going to be the trickiest bit to paint, and very important that I get a good finish on it. This is going to be a case of slow and steady wins the race. I'm not going to show much of this on screen as I need to support my hand to get a good shake-free brush on. Here's a little snapshot along the way. The black is already tying the model together, but it is a tricky paint. Sometime later, here it is with all the black done. That was a slog and a half. I think that ended up taking 3 evenings after work. With the black done though, it's time to move on to paint the last little bits on the hull. Here I paint the ropes up in Tamiya Desert Yellow. Use some AK World War I khaki to do the ship wheel. The windows I did with some watered down army painted deep blue. And off screen I touched up a few errors on the deck with skeleton bone, as it's not a perfect match for Humbrol Desert Tan, but it's close enough for me. While I was doing this, I also went over some of the details at the bow and stern of the ship with a thin coat of army painted bright gold, as apparently they're gold gilded and not yellow. Next up, I washed the decks down in AK khaki brown to give them some depth. This is how the ship's looking so far. After swabbing the decks, I also gave the sides the same treatment but with a lighter coat of brown, just to muck up the sides a bit and make them look a bit weathered as opposed to really clean. While I'm waiting on some more browns to sort the masts out, I'm going to paint the cannons. The lower part of the cannon I'm going to be painting in Army Painter Basilisk Brown, as having looked at the cannons on HMS Victory, the cannon carriages seem to be painted in the same shade as the hull sides. Adding the cannons is a bit tricky. It helps if you turn them on the sides to get them through the gun ports. Once they're on though, they really help bring the deck of this ship to life. It's nice to see a bit more detail down there. Main ship nearly done, I move on to painting the masts. I gave these a base coat of black before painting them up in Tamiya Desert Yellow. With the main shade on, I tidied up the black on the masts, before giving them a wash in BS Dark Earth to give them a bit of depth. I also gave the decks a light wash in this shade, as the decks were looking a little bleached, and I think that they stood out a bit against the deeper tones of the rest of the ship. Before adding the masts to the ship, I painted up the shrouds in Tamiya XF79 Linden Brown deck, as these will be a nightmare to paint when they're on the ship. Adding the mast to the ship is easy, but adding the shrouds is a little tricky. Though the instructions don't show it well, the base of these fits onto these little lips. It's a bit tricky to line up the masts and shrouds. If you're having trouble with the shrouds, put the top of the shrouds deeper under the platform more, as if you place it with them at the end, the fit can be a bit tight. But once everything is in the right position, the fit's quite good and it all falls into place and becomes quite sturdy. I do think though that the shrouds look a little bit thick, but then again, this is only a 1-deck sloop, and most of the reference pictures I looked at of old ships were of bigger 2- and 3-deck ships. Anyway, with the shrouds on, it's time to finish the model by adding the rigging. For this, I'm using elastic, as it's a lot easier to get taut than string. It's probably a bit thick for a ship of this scale, but it will match the shrouds at least. Adding the rigging is a long process, but it's fairly simple. The instructions give you a good idea of where the rigging's meant to go, with only a few head-scratchy moments along the way. One thing to note if you're adding the rigging is a couple of holes will need to be drilled into the sides of the ship to get all the rigging on. This isn't mentioned in any early steps, and yeah, it would have been nice to know I was going to have to put holes in my ship right at the end of the build, but it doesn't really make much difference overall. Anyway, with the rigging on, that concludes this build. I wasn't too happy with how this kit had come out. Something just didn't look right, but the rigging right at the end really brings the last bit of the ship together and makes it look more like a model. In conclusion, the Mr. Craft Hobby Kit's 1:120 scale Black Falcon is very much a kit of its time, showing all the hallmarks of a kit made in the 1980s. I really enjoyed making this kit, but it does need a bit of work to get it to go together. I was a bit disappointed that the kit didn't come with sails though. I found this kit a bit contrasting, as on one hand, having only 45 parts, it's fairly fast and simple to build basically, but when it comes to painting and detailing, this kit is very involved and quite challenging getting all the straight lines and colour contrasts on cleanly, and will benefit from being pre-painted and having a tactical approach to how you paint this thing. The detail on this kit is not the most in-depth. It was probably wasted on a landlubber such as myself, as my knowledge of old ships is not the greatest, but I get the feeling that as a base for a more in-depth pirate or navy ship, where someone knows where and what extras to add, this kit will be perfect to build upon. I think this kit is suitable for an intermediate modeller that knows the score by now and can see a few of the issues coming down the line. Price wise, this kit cost me £16 brand new and took me many hours to build, so I'd say it's well worth the money. It's quite cheap for a big model kit, to be honest with you, and yeah, it's always nice to go back to the 80s and that and build a bit of a retro kit where it's not quite perfect. They're always fun builds. Anyway, that's my look at the Mr. Hobbycraft Pirate Ship Black Falcon. As always, thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing, as it really helps the channel out. But until next time, look after yourselves and have a good one. Goodbye.